Shalom and welcome to the 2019 Winter Doorkeepers Conference. This is the second day of the conference, and in this session we're going to talk about how to teach our children to Shema. And Shema is the Hebrew word for listening. So we're going to teach our children how to listen. And why is that even important? My name is Elliott, and I'm the creator and founder of Homeschooling Torah, along with my husband.
How are we doing?
This is Kraig Elliott, and you know what? I brought him on because I know for a fact he knows how to help kids listen. I've seen him do it for years and years and years, and honestly, I am not kidding when I tell you he's an expert at this. He's an expert because we have 7 kids, but not really that. He's also been involved with kids' lives and as a teacher in high schools and in church ministry for years. And
don't forget about being a counselor and an administrator in high school.
All right, so you've been involved in a lot of things with kids. And one of the things that we have been talking about our whole married lives, because it was something that bothered us, is we would notice kids that just couldn't listen, they couldn't pay attention. So honey, there was this one church that we attended when we were in Florida, our first church down there. And I had a newborn, and he was too young to even know how to listen yet, but I was watching all the other parents and seeing how they interacted with their kids. And I noticed there was this one little girl who, when her mom would say something, she would immediately stop playing and look at her mom and just stop and look. Mm-hmm. There was another little boy who was completely the opposite, and his mom would walk in, call his name, and he would completely tune her out and ignore her and continue doing whatever it was he was doing. And I remember at that time talking to you about that and thinking, how do we make it so that our kids will be like the little girl and not like the little boy? Did you ever have this problem when you were a high school teacher?
Oh, absolutely. And not only did I have this problem, but I think it was more like the boy than it was the girl, almost, I'd say, 75% of the time. So say 3/4 of the population is
I know like it bothered you because you would talk about it a lot.
It does, because you see a great deal of times where the students and stuff would just totally ignore the teachers, administration, faculty, and the staff members that were there. And that the atmosphere that creates is one, well, when you're thinking of education, especially, and trying to learn things that are needed for the future, that you don't have the time, you don't have the ability to do that because you're dealing with discipline and you're involved in arguments and your kid's not listening and tuning you out. And when you have one individual who does that, the teacher then has to focus on that child, understanding that if it's not dealt with, then the other children are going to be following suit, because that's how human nature works. That's how our sin nature works. So it is something that is extremely important, and of course, dealing in the confines of teachers and going through teacher training and through your college classes and stuff like that is something that is, you basically have one whole section of your college education that is spent on trying to teach you how to what they call classroom manage, or how to manage the students that are under your care.
So basically the problem that kids can't listen, it steals time and resources. It's not economical. It's horrible. You know what the real problem, though, and the real reason we're talking about it today is because if our kids can't listen to us, they can't listen to the Father.
Yes, and so when we think about this in our relationship between parents and children, when I was doing most of my training and most of my teaching and counseling, I was heavily involved with students who had behavior problems, who I worked at several alternative schools. I developed a school for alternative kids who had behavior problems, who had been kicked out of school because of their behavior problems, things like this. dealing with learning disabilities. I was heavily involved with special education, and the teachers I oftentimes in my classes had aides and I had several students who had what we call IEPs, or individual educational plans. And you would have to work with each one of these things. And so there was a lot of experience in dealing with a variety of both behavior and learning disabilities and things like this. And in doing that, I have gained a lot of experience in variety of how children react and work and things like this. Mm-hmm. But in a great deal of those things, it was very easy to see that the learning disabilities, the behavior disorders, or the learning disabilities especially, were not the cause of the behavior problems. It was dealing with the fact that the kids were not taught how to listen, and were not taught how to follow what they were supposed to do, what their instructions were. Mm-hmm. And I know that, and so that's a lot of what we're going to be discussing today.
So the Hebrew word Shema, that's what we used in the title for this program. It comes from Deuteronomy, where it says, "Hear, O Israel." And that's how Yehovah talks to his people. He says, "Hear, O Israel," and then he starts in on what he wants them to do. It's the very first thing. The word Shema does not just mean to hear you, like, oh, I heard that train go by a second ago. That's not Shema. The word Shema means more than that. It's to pay attention to the point that you actually follow through in action on what you heard. So it's more like, do, O Israel, because you heard what I told you to do, and then you turned around and did it. So it's not just, I heard you, I'm going to keep going, like the little boy in the nursery, but it's the little girl who stopped what she was doing and turned her head and listened to her parents. And for us, we have to do that to God. It's not just, I heard you, I read my Bible today. We have to actually do it. So there's somebody I know of in Scripture that had to learn. It took him 3 times to finally realize that Yehovah was talking to him, and that is Samuel. And when he was a young boy, he was asleep at night, and Yehovah said, "Samuel, Samuel," and he kept thinking it was Eli. Now he did get up. If I were in bed, sometimes when I'm in bed, I just go back to sleep if I hear something. But Samuel, he did get up. He just didn't recognize that it was Yehovah's voice. But he is such an example of training himself to listen. And then he became a great prophet and a judge in Israel, and anointed the first king. And anyway,
I was going to say on that note, he had to be taught to listen to God's voice.
It took 3 nights.
Well, and who was
over
the teacher?
And over. Yehovah.
No, that wasn't
Eli.
Eli was the teacher.
Eli was the teacher.
So in essence, it was his parent, his father. So if he hadn't had that instruction, would he have ever listened to Yehovah?
No, he wouldn't have even known what that sound meant.
Exactly.
And that's such a good point. Now there's an example of someone in the Bible that was not a good listener.
Can I?
Yeah, you
go ahead and do that one. So at juxtaposition to Samuel, we are told of a different individual in the scriptures, and that being King Saul. Now, King Saul, when he was originally anointed the king, had a heart for God and had God's spirit upon him, and was working great things for the children of Israel and obedience to God.
Seemed humble.
Yes, it did. It seemed like he was quite humble. But somewhere in the process of being king, we should say, the old saying goes, it went to his head. And so being in that place of authority, it went to his head. It was, we might say that his character was not that of continued strength in the Word of God. He may have had a little bit of a teaching of it and an initial start, but it wasn't continued, and in so doing, he lost it.
I just thought of something. In a way, Samuel was almost like his parent, because he was the one who taught. Samuel was the one who taught Eli how to listen, but
No,
No.
Eli taught Samuel how to
was
listen.
the one who taught Saul how to listen,
Yes,
and Saul
yes.
stopped listening to Samuel and to Jehovah.
Yes. So we look at Saul. What we see is that the narrative that goes in 1 Samuel 15 is that Saul was told by God to go and to destroy another nation, and he was to completely destroy them and wipe all the men out and so on and so forth. And he went and they conquered, and God was with them. Jehovah was with them, and they defeated the other enemy. And they were supposed to wipe everybody out and not take anything with them. But Saul looked around and said, "You know what? There's some good things in here. I like their cattle, and I like their land, and I like their women and their children and stuff, and they could be slaves and things like that for us, and wives and so on and so forth." And he brought them all back. And in fact, he brought their leader back, their king back also. And his view on this was, well, this is a sign that will make me look good among all the children of Israel. I can bring back their king and show that I have all the power in this situation. Mm-hmm. And so what he had done is his pride had gotten the best of him, and he was saying, I did all these things. Look at me. I have the authority to conquer and to defeat these people. And he totally forgot that God was involved, and that God was the one that gave him the victory and the command that God had given him. And so what happened is he basically said, I am the one who has the ability and the control and the authority of these things, and I will make the decisions on what is going to happen. And in the process, he led the children of Israel into sin and against God. And it was a specific sin that was done, and that was the sin of rebellion. And so in verse 23, Saul comes back and goes to see Samuel and says, hey, look, we did what we're supposed to do. And Samuel looks around and goes, basically in essence, no, you didn't. You didn't follow God's commands whatsoever. Look at, who's this guy over here? What are all these noises I hear in the background? Is this mooing and clucking and baaing of sheep and all these things? Weren't you supposed to wipe everything out? And he confronts Saul at this point in time. And Saul, tries to, of course, make excuses for why he did it. But Samuel says to Saul that this is rebellion. And rebellion, in this instance, he says, is as the sin of witchcraft. So it's vile, it's evil against God, is what basically Samuel tells Saul. It is like one of the ultimate evils, how we say. Mm-hmm. And so rebellion is, in essence, not listening to God. Mm-hmm. So Saul refused to listen. He heard what God told him to do, but he did not listen to what God told him to do. And because of that, God punished him. He lost the throne. His line was destroyed, and it would be given. And God said, I'm going to give the line of Israel to someone else. And of course, we know that was David, who became the king after Saul, and not Jonathan, Saul's son. So there was a great deal of this understanding of rebellion.
I just wanted to point out, since this is a Doorkeepers conference, and our first day of our conference, we talked about how witchcraft and idolatry are some of the most evil things that we have to keep out of our house and guard against, but we don't normally see our children not listening to us and obeying us as that bad. Mm-mm. We just kind of put up with it, and yet it can have the same result of destroying our families and just wiping out our family. I mean, I don't want my descendants, my children, to be wiped out. That's horrible.
Absolutely not.
So
So if we look at different places, and we look in the book of Proverbs, and it talks a lot about this connection between fathers mm-hmm. and children, and listening and not listening. Mm-hmm. And so just some of the verses that we just real quick talked about or looked up. Proverbs 15:5 says, a fool, this being the child, despises his father's instructions. All right. So he despises his father's instructions. This is a context of rebellion. Okay. But he who receives correction is prudent. So prudent, the concept of what wisdom, we can say. Prudent is as a synonym of wisdom. And so a person is wise. Proverbs 19:26, he who mistreats his father and chases away his mother is a son who causes shame and brings reproach. So a child who does not listen, who is rebellious, brings shame on the parents. And of course we see this all the time in our society. You just go out, go to stores, and you see the parent.
You feel bad for them.
Yeah, the child who is throwing a tantrum and is arguing, and I mean he's like a 4-year-old or even a 2-year-old. I've seen 2-year-olds do this, and probably even less. And the parent is trying to do the shopping and things like this, and this little kid is telling them that they're doing things wrong and that they are doing what they're supposed to do. And the kid's saying, I want this and I want that. And when they don't get it, they scream and yell. Have you seen kids hit the parents?
Absolutely. Isn't that one? Yeah, chasing away his mother.
Yeah. So he's like attacking her because she doesn't give him what he wants. Yeah. He's rebelling against her authority. Yeah. Going on, whoever curses his father or his mother, his lamp will be put out in deep darkness. Proverbs 30, verse 11. There is a generation that curses its father and does not bless its mother. And so we can see there, they look upon the father as something that is wrong and worthy of being cursed. Not only do they just not listen, but they've grown to a point now in their rebellion that they actually look on the father as a nuisance, a thing that is getting in the way of them being able to accomplish what they want to accomplish. Okay?
I think this happens more, even we see this more in the teenage years too, this horribleness, and how do you even restore something like that? It's something we don't want to have happen to our kids.
Yes. Proverbs 30, verse 17 says, the eye that mocks his father and scorns obedience to his mother, the ravens of the valley will pick it out, and the young eagles will eat it. So the eye of the child,
rolling their eyes.
Yeah. Have you ever seen that before? I was talking, and I remember a student one time. I was in the hallway of school. This is high school students. This is like a junior, senior. This is a kid who was supposed to be, a leader, kind of thing like this. And I needed to talk to this individual because he was not following the rules. And as I was required by those in authority over me to deal with this situation, if we saw students doing this, we were supposed to go and correct the student, because obviously the administration knew that if we let this go, that if one student did it, the next one would do it, and become a situation that would come out of control. And this being a student who was supposed to be a leader and well thought of and stuff like that, he was required to do the same things that all the other students were. But because he understood that, like Saul, that he had a status in the school, he wanted to try and push the rules, to rebel. And so I went to try and correct this student. I called him by name. I went after him down the hallway, and it was a little noisy. He was in between classes and stuff. So at first I was like, well, maybe he just didn't hear me. So I got up to him and I was calling his name like I was right behind him. And I went to touch his arm, and he did this whole like shrug thing, like get off me, and turned and looked at me and basically scorned me, and looked at me as if I was insignificant and did not have any authority whatsoever to be able to talk to him and to try and correct his behavior. So he had in his mind the same thing that Samuel had in his mind towards Jehovah and God, is that I have the authority over you. I am equal in authority to you. I have the choice and the right to do as I see fit and not listen to you.
You had mentioned to me that you thought there were 2 reasons for rebellion. Can you go into that a little bit?
Absolutely. I was trying to think through this concept of rebellion, and going through, and being my background also being in history, I really enjoy history and studying ancient history and American history and British history. I really like the whole concept of world history and how everything connects, especially. And so I was thinking on this concept of rebellion and going through the rebellion in history. And so I was thinking of more recent history, and then I was discussing this with Ann, and we were going back and going, well, let's look at rebellion throughout the scriptures. And of course, the first rebellion we see is Adam and Eve.
Oh, true. Yeah,
you thought of it, yeah. So, Adam and Eve, we see that, and of course, there they wanted to rebel because Satan, the serpent, says, hey, if you eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you will be like God. So what was their concept? We want to have that same authority structure as God. We want to be equal with God, right?
I think we're equal.
Yes. And so in doing so, we want to choose what the instructions are, not God, right?
Yep.
So Adam and Eve did this. So if we look at what the scripture says, of course, it's equivalent to pride, right? Eve was deceived, it says, but Adam chose willingly to do this, and in so doing, he chose out of pride.
I just never thought about this before, and I wonder what the look on their face was when they did that.
Yeah. It soon became fear, though, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. It did.
So, but with Adam and Eve, the first thing was pride. So we see pride as a core of rebellion, right? The Bible also links stubbornness, all right? Stubbornness and pride as being synonymous with rebellion, all right? So we go on further, we see Cain. Cain, of course, again, God says, here's the command I'm giving you. Cain says, I want to do it this way. And so in doing so, he throws off, so we speak, the authority of God and says, this is what's going to happen. And then when God deals with him, what happens?
Oh, I would definitely say he had that look on his face. He was like, what did I do? I'm not my brother's keeper.
Yeah. But but what I'm saying is, when God says, be careful, temptation is at the door, or sin is at the door, that's when he went, I don't care. And it went off and murdered his brother because he thought, well, if I get rid of him, God will look at me and I'll be the favorite. And I get to do what I want. Next, we look at the Tower of Babel. And with Tower of Babel, we see another time of rebellion where the people, again, were like wanting to throw off the control of God. They did not want to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Instead, they wanted to stay close together because they were afraid of the animals and stuff. And so they tried to stay together and, of course, rebel. And they, of course, rebelled against God and his commands for them there. And then we see, of course, Nimrod, who is this mighty hunter. And he was this great man, and he was able to defeat a lot of these wild animals that everybody was afraid of. And so they all rallied around him and said, "You're going to be our king, and we're gonna exalt you." And of course, doing that, many people, of course, think that he was the leader of the Tower of Babel and the one who began to develop this high place, this tower that would be there to exalt man and the power of man when they come together and do things, and that God was trying to wanted them to spread out because he wanted to keep them weak and stuff. If they stayed together, they'd be powerful and great. And Nimrod, of course, was the key person in all this and the key authority. And he was rebelling against what God had commanded them to do. If we go a long way closer to more current history, we begin to see rebellions happening. For a long time, rebellion really didn't necessarily happen when we had the consolidation of power throughout much of the world under certain kings and stuff like that. You do have periodic instances of it, but
they might have been wicked and rebellious against God, but they didn't let the people rebel against them.
No, definitely not. So if we go further into that, we see this authority structure happening, and in one instance we see, most of the time, if there was a change in power, it happened because the king died without heirs or something like that, or there was an heir that was extremely weak, and everybody else kind of rose and destroyed him. But the one instance where we see this changing again to this open rebellion is in the revolutions that happened, the American Revolution and the French Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And we see in the American Revolution, French Revolution, almost a little bit different viewpoint. Instead of being something of pride, where an individual or something said, I am more in control, I'm a better ruler than the one who was in power, we see a people who were what we call frustrated with the authority structure. In the American Revolution, the reason it happened was dealt with taxation without representation. You've probably heard those words used quite a bit in dealing with the American Revolution. With that, in the American Revolution, what happened is you had these colonies who were becoming steadily more wealthy and were having their own economy, and they were so far away from England, the mother country, that things didn't work the same way between the two groups. Yet, what was happening is Great Britain was making all these rules and stuff for the colonies, and they wanted all of the economy from the colonies, but they would not give the economies or the colonies any say in the rules that they were being governed by. And so over and over again, those in authority over here and those who were like leaders in the economy of the United States, or excuse me, of the colonies, went over there and began to try and say, hey, we want the same representation that Cornwall or Wales or Scotland or York or London has, these different areas, territories of what was the British Empire in the mainland, and so that we have a say in how we are going to be governed. And of course, the king and those in authority and power over in Great Britain said no. So what happened is, of course, we know they rebelled, and we call it the American what? Revolution. But if you go in England, you know what they call it? The rebellion.
Are you serious? Yes, but they were so frustrated. The government wasn't listening to them. They were having to put up with horrible, lack because no one would listen to them. And you mentioned this happens in parenting sometimes too.
Yes, definitely. And so we look, and this is definitely spoken about in scriptures. So on one hand, we have the rebellion aspect dealing with pride, and we're going to deal a lot with that today in our how-tos and stuff like that. But we also have this talked about with frustration, and we look at Ephesians Chapter 6. All right, and would you want to read that?
Yes.
Ephesians Chapter 6.
It says, "Children, obey your parents in Yehovah, for this is right." And that's a quote from, of course, the 10 Commandments. It says, "Honor your father and mother," which is the first commandment with a promise. Okay, so here we deal with the fact that children are to obey, and they are under the authority and not just obey, honor. Yes, and honor what they do. So there's respect that's supposed to be dealt with. There's listening to them, doing what they say. There's not a thing of they get to do whatever they want, or they have authority, they have rights, so on and so forth. It's they are to listen to their parents. So go on. Says that it may go well with them and that they may enjoy a long life on the earth. Okay, so that's to the children. The children's responsibility is to listen and obey. Hear, do. So go on. And it says in verse 4, "Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of Yehovah." Okay, so it says in the NIV, exasperates. In the King James, it says, "Do not provoke your children to wrath," right? And so what we see in that concept of provoking to wrath is this concept of frustration. And what is happening is that the father, it bounces around his commands, his rules, his laws over the children, and they have no ability to understand what are the boundaries that they're required to be within. They do not even understand the authority structure over them. And so naturally, they can step over the boundary because the boundary is moving constantly, or they go in a certain direction thinking they're within the boundary, and the dad decides that day to move the boundary. Change the rules. And what do we know in the scripture about moving boundaries? That's very much against the Torah. That's against the Torah, very much so. So
the father is bouncing these boundaries around, and the mother is bouncing the boundaries around. Or sometimes what we see is the father has one set of boundaries, and the mother has another set of boundaries.
Yeah, she doesn't show respect either.
Yeah, well, and sometimes they don't work together in many different directions. And what happens is it frustrates the child. And the child rebels simply because what he's being put under is not sustainable. It's not. He has no ability to be able to live under these type of situations.
Here's another time, two moms are talking and
Mhm.
talking and talking and talking, and the children never get a chance to say anything at all. And
Mhm.
kids come over and try to get mom's attention, and they're waving their arms at them, and yeah, I don't know. But the moms are just like, whatever, go away, I'm talking right now. And
Mhm.
yet, so what are the kids gonna do? They're just gonna go do whatever they want to do because they're frustrated.
Yeah.
They've never heard.
They don't have the ability. Well, they don't have the ability to connect with the parent and ask what's going on because the parent's not even paying attention to them. I'll go even a little bit more unique situation, not quite that way, but we probably all experienced this one way or another. But let's say we're on Shabbat, we're on Sabbath, and of course I'll go and say all parents love to talk. I've seen this. I like to talk with people too, and you're in the middle of this great theological conversation. You're discussing things, and your child comes over and needs to ask if, like, for instance, if they could go outside to play, and knowing it's muddy, they're not sure if that would be allowed, so they want to come and ask. So they're over there, but the parents are yakking, and the dad sees the kid, but yeah, they're in the middle of this good discussion, and they might lose their train of thought and things like this. And eventually, the kid just blurts out in the middle of the conversation and says something and interrupts everything. Why? And the father looks at him and says, "Don't interrupt." You've seen that, because the rule he has, the child has no means for which to be able to communicate with the father or the mother, and the parent has done nothing to show them how to properly be able to communicate with them. And so it frustrates the child.
Do you have a solution for this?
Yes, we do. And do we want to handle that at this
moment? Let's do it now,
okay.
So we don't forget.
Sounds good. So this is where we are to train up our children, okay? The father, in order to not frustrate his child, must train them in how to deal with this. And we've learned this as husband and wife. And I think it's extremely important as husband and wife to do this too. And in so doing, we model it for our children as well as tell them how to do it.
So busy talking.
Yes. If I go back real quick, one more case with the scenario of the child on Shabbat interrupting. Now, that child has never been taught anything about authority structure either. And that happens too. I believe that a child is under the authority of an adult and is not equal with an adult in rights or any way, shape, or form.
Which is, pride, as you said before, is trying to make oneself equal with God or equal with the authority person.
And that's okay. The Bible says that's the way things are supposed to be. God is up here.
It's okay to have
authority structure. Yeah. God is up here, and the king's under God, and then man's under the king, and then children are under the parent and stuff like this. So the authority structure is a biblical concept that we need to say that first. Okay.
Yeah.
Would you agree with me on that? Okay. So then, and I know you do, I'm just asking her on here, we do agree completely on this. So if that structure though is not taught, the other scenario of the child interrupting is we're talking, we're having a good discussion, everything like that, and the kid wants to know right away candy. He wants candy. Or actually, here's a better one. I'll switch that and say the kid doesn't think that he's the center of attention, and he's not getting the proper attention from all the adults in the room. So the kid comes out and starts shouting things out in the middle of the conversation that are totally not even related to what's being talked about. Is not asking a question. Just boom, inserts his comments into this conversation because he wants to be that center of attention. He wants to gather the attention of the adults onto that child.
Mm-hmm.
You ever seen that before? Okay, so that child has never been taught that there's a difference in authority between adults and children.
Mm-hmm.
And he thinks of himself, or she thinks of himself as equal with all the adults in the room, okay, including the parent.
And sometimes I think the parents look at their children as if they are equal.
Mm-hmm. And they're
is afraid to say, you know what, they're not quite equal. I have been placed by God in authority over, and I have to act that way. You know, we feel like that would be wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I feel guilty for taking the authority that God has given us.
Yeah. So what has to happen is two things. Number one, and then both of them deal with the parents. It's not the child that is that's the problem. It's actually the parents. And we as parents, this is where we have that responsibility. If we are going to bring a child into this world, God says, you, me, we're the ones who have to deal with this, okay? And this is what you're going to do. And so dealing with that means we have to train them about authority.
Mm-hmm.
We have to teach them about authority, and that's what this whole conference is dealing with, a lot of it. And the whole idea of listening is that we have to train our kids on authority. And two, we have to give them ways in order to be within those clear-cut boundaries so that they do not rebel and get frustrated and rebel because we aren't doing our job correctly.
Mm-hmm. So we have to be a just judge. We have to be fair.
Yes.
But we have to actually be a judge. We can't just sit around and not restrain our children when they are doing something that is wrong, or, you know, just feel like I don't feel like bothering, or I don't feel like I have the right to bother because that's a human being. I'm a human being. We're all equal. That's a very American thought, but it's not biblical. Yeah.
Which goes into history. But real quick, before we continue out in the history aspect of it, I want to go back and I want to make sure we get this, the teaching how to do this. So once we first off had dealt with authority, which that we're not going to deal with at this moment, but the procedure you can teach and model to your children in order to get them to not have to interrupt you is, and I'll do it up here as you saw Ann kind of doing it earlier, is we just put our hand like this or on the leg.
No, that's not it.
That's creating an authority. That's trying to say, look at me, look at me.
So it's really quiet and just wait.
Yeah, it's one hand right there.
Mm-hmm.
And what that does is it says, it's twofold. Well, number one, Dad, I understand that you have an authority over me and you may be in an important discussion. And I don't want to interrupt your train of thought. But it also says too, Dad, I have something I need to tell you, and I need to make sure that you are listening to me so that I can share with you and you can give the right decision to me on what I need to ask you or tell you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
And then the parent can go, hold on a second, 1 second, I need to help my child.
Yes. Or they can wait until there's a break. They can, and here's the thing. It may be you want your kid to wet your pants while you're waiting for them to, or waiting for a break in the conversation. So what I usually will do, if this is the situation, say I'm the child and Ann's the parent, is as the parent, I'm looking and I'm waiting. And if there isn't a break in this, I say, just a minute, I need to talk to my son. But in the meantime, to let the child know that I understand that they need something, I will take, I'll use Ann, and I will put my hand somewhere on them to let them know that I feel their hand. Okay? So the child puts up here, and then that's a good way too, she just taps my hand and say, hey, I get you need something, just give me a second, I'm looking for a break in the conversation here.
Yeah.
And in so doing, that way, there is an understanding of respect from the child to the parent. There's a boundary that says, I understand your authority, that you are in the middle of something, an important discussion, and I need to wait my turn. But on the same thing, it says to the child, I recognize that you need something, and I am working actively to get a spot so that I can listen to you, what you need to say too. And in so doing, you do not get the interruption. You do not get where the kid's trying to take attention away from the adults and wants to be the center. And instead, you are working together to and to be able to communicate properly. All right, so this brings us, so we've talked about the frustration aspect and versus pride. And we've gone through the American Revolution and the concept of frustration and how they rebelled because of that frustration. And it's really important to understand that if we look at most of the early American fathers and the fathers of the American Revolution and stuff, we realize from the writings they really did not want to break away from England. They felt it was the last recourse they had because they'd exhausted everything else.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Well, scooch forward another 40, 50, 60 years from the American Revolution, and you come to a gentleman by the name of Karl Marx. And he writes this book, the Communist Manifesto, and of course we here understand that we link the word communism to him in this form of government and political system. In that, it basically had this concept that everyone is equal. There is no authority structure. The worker is equal to the boss. The manager is equal to the owner. The owner is equal to the king, and there's no difference in authority structure whatsoever. His whole concept is we got to get rid of authority, okay,
and make everyone
equal. And when everybody's equal, then everything will be perfect, and there'll be peace and no problems, and so on and so forth. Well, almost 175 years later, we've found that that is totally not the case. And of course, we look at the communist countries, the countries who claim to be communist and follow Marxism. We see that in all of them, there's an authority structure, an authority structure that is oftentimes violently
abusive.
Well, but violently controlled. It uses violence often to deal with keeping that control. And so those who are in authority are more than willing to use violence to keep the status quo, to keep them in authority and everybody else underneath them. And in reality, what we've seen is not that it makes everybody equal and happy, but there is a great deal of it's almost like slavery that's happened. Violence is incurred, and a great deal of death and murder. And those in authority actually are even more authoritarian than the regime that they overcame. And this has happened over and over and over again in the history of the world, in recent history. But the interesting thing about communism was what happened even in the United States and how it dealt with the way that children and parents looked at each other. And so we see from the United States in the 50s and 60s, as communism and the concepts of communism started to pervade into the United States, that you had this mindset that came about that, again, that children were equal with their adults and with their parents, and that they did not oftentimes have to listen. And of course, that their parents were oppressive, or their rules were silly and we don't care about them, we don't need to follow them. And unfortunately, in the 50s, the supposed golden age of the United States, where great wealth was happening and there was a baby boom going on because there was this wealth going on. And we had the concepts of the Leave It to Beaver family, the Cleavers, and other, like My Three Sons, and all these like happy, friendly, perfect families in our country. That actually that time frame was what caused destructiveness of much of what we see in our country today. And it was the first time that there was an increase in wealth among teenagers. It was the first time that teenagers actually had jobs separate from their parents, or making an income separate from their parents, had disposable income. And so what you saw in the marketing of the world was they began to focus on children as a new source of income, a new class of income where they could go and market and say, hey, buy goods from us. That had never been done before in history. Prior to this, only adults were targeted. Okay? But what that did is it created disposable income, jobs separate from the rest of the family, and being targeted for marketing and buying goods and services, that it came about that children began to think that they were an authority in and of themselves, a new, shall we say, class of people. And communistic mentalities was beginning to be taught in the school system and in the colleges and universities especially, and it led into the 60s to the rebellion of the generation of that time. And they basically said, I do not have to listen to my parents. I do not have to follow the status quo. I'm going to do whatever I want. And that is where we see today all the concepts of the rights of the child that is going on in the UN and throughout our countries. Same concepts in schools, where we see that the authority structure of the parents has been almost eroded completely, and even the authority structure of the teachers and the administrators in the schools has been eroded almost completely, and the children in many instances are almost running the schools. I mean, it's a very tenuous situation where that is happening in our schools.
So, honey, how do we fix this problem?
Okay, and that is the great question. How do we teach our children
to listen? And should we start at the older kids and talk to them? Or should we start at the infants and newborns and very young toddlers? Where's the best way to start fixing this problem? I know, obviously, the Word of God, but
absolutely,
practically speaking
from the Word of God. And here's the two things. We have two different things we're probably going to talk about in this next few minutes. One is I know we've struggled with having a lot of parents who have asked us over the years, my teenager doesn't want to go with us, doesn't want to follow Torah, does not want to listen when I do school, those kind of things. So that's one aspect of you're talking about teenagers, kids who have the ability to think on their own and rebelling against their parents. The other group is the younger children. And with dealing with the younger children, we have two things. One, we see an expansion of children who are disobedient, little children, even under the age of 5 and 3 and 4 and 2. And we see parents who we talk about the terrible twos and this type of situation.
Just expect it to be normal. Yeah. It doesn't sound like Jehovah expects it to be normal.
No. And that's what we want to really, something I want to focus on too, is what is it that is your desire for your children and your relationship with your children? Is your desire for your relationship with your children to be one of peace in your home, where everyone is happy and overall and
functioning as it should,
and that there is peace in the relationship, not every once in a while, but almost all the time, between the parent and the child, and the parent listens to the authority of the parent. The child listens, to the authority of the parent,
and the parent listens to the authority of Jehovah.
Yes, absolutely. And that in so doing, there is a proper authority structure within the family. And this is why this is important, because we've actually seen in our experience families who have had children who, when they've grown up, we've been around long enough now, we've seen families from kids from little who grow up all the way to adulthood, and they've done all right. They turn out, they listen to the parents, relatively speaking, and things like that. But when they were little, they were kind of
let them run.
They were wild.
They were,
shall we say, holy terrors. I don't know where that word came from, but I've heard it used of these type of children, where they're basically they rule the house, and they're angry a lot of times, and
so then they have this horrible time period, maybe in the middle years somewhere, where they have to really crack down, and for an extended amount of time, life is horrible in their home as they have to go back and fix all the problems.
Exactly. So we're gonna let's show, where do we want to start with?
Well, I have a book, 4 Foundations of Lifelong Learning, in which we talk about preschoolers and how to help them. And this is something that you and I did with our kids, and it really worked. So when our kids were really small, we would tell them to not just listen to us, but we would want to know that we want them to acknowledge that they actually hurt us. So first of all, we would have them look at us in the eyes, because if they're looking at you, you know they're paying attention more to you than to their toys or TV or whatever. And secondly, we would tell them what we wanted, and then they would have to say, yes, mommy, or yes, daddy, and then expect them to do it. And it seemed if they would look at us and acknowledge us, they were almost always sure to follow up. But if they wouldn't look at us and they wouldn't acknowledge us, they usually didn't do what we said either. Now, you told me about a thing that you guys did in football practice. I wasn't out with you at football practice, so can you explain that a little bit?
Yes, and this is a perfect example of this with, shall we say, young men, teenagers, okay? And at football practice, as teachers, and wanting to be able to have the most efficient ability to train these men, young men, to be able to go out and do what we asked them to do.
He was a coach for 12 years. Yeah.
So what we would do is, and I was taught this technique, is when we would teach a technique, before we would do that, the coach would say, eyes, and he would say, click. And then the students, the football players were supposed to say it by eyes, click. And it meant that what they were doing is they were to give their eyes, their attention to the coach and look at them. And in saying verbally eyes, click, it reinforced that concept of being forward or moving forward. It's actually taken, believe it or not, from training of animals, and dogs especially. If you've ever, I didn't see this from talking to the individuals, but I've kind of put two together. You've probably seen the people like dog trainers and the really good ones that use those little clickers. And when they are trying to teach a behavior to a dog, there's usually treats and a clicker involved. And the eventual goal is to go from the treats and the clicker to just a clicker, and eventually to neither, where your speech is what teaches them.
Reminds me of Yeshua. He said, my sheep hear my voice.
Yes, absolutely. Cool. And they listen.
You know, also, didn't you say something about in the military? Now, what do they do there to kind of get everybody's attention? And, you know, it's not like you just drop off at basic training and
yes.
You know, they have to actually, what do? I mean, most kids coming into basic training are not necessarily your model children. I mean, some are. Kids might be in the military, but
there's quite a variety, and throughout history.
Variety, that's the word.
We'll go back and we will say this. Okay, there have been historical things of groups where they actually took prisoners, men who had been incarcerated, and a lot of them may have been violent criminals and things like this. And they were some of them even on death row. And during World War II, they did this. And they said, okay, this is your last chance. Okay? If you don't take this up, then you're done. And they brought them in, and they trained them to be a special forces unit that was trained to do something that was extraordinary, beyond what the normal forces were going to do. These were men that they were going to train to take something that was untakeable by the normal troops.
Which, by the way, is what we want for our kids, right?
Yes. You know, this is why we are to be doorkeepers, right? And we want to train
the kingdom. They're going to be special forces.
Yes, we want the special forces for the kingdom. You're right. So what they would do is they took these men out and they isolated them from everything else, and they, in essence, broke these men down. They took everything away from them. This is where you see the concepts usually in the military. They shave their heads, and they take away all their clothes, all their belongings, and they give them new clothes, which are plain and all the same, a uniform, so that everybody is the same, right? But what is the one thing we all see in this, though? They are equal only among themselves. They are not equal with those in authority over them. And that concept of authority is heavily taught during that time, what we call boot camp or training.
And I think to myself, again, in an ideal world, if every single parent had taught their child to be like this from an extremely young age, to be obedient, to listen, to put their eyes up, in an ideal world, they would all enter the military and never even need that. They would just go immediately into special forces training. So, you know.
And they could go right into the training, but the problem is that the military has found out that men aren't oftentimes trained this and don't understand what their necessity is, and so they have to break that person down to bring them into a unit.
And I think that's probably what Jehovah did to the children of Israel when he took them into the wilderness. They would not listen to him. So for 40 years.
Was their boot camp.
Yeah. And we don't want that for our kids. We don't want them to
We don't want
listen.
them to be punished and have death as an ultimate recourse because they won't choose to obey. So number one with that, they would have to break down that and develop that authority structure. And once that was done and they were willing to listen, then they could train them to be this elite special forces group, which saved many lives. So you took convicts and were capable of retraining them and making them into a group that actually saved lives. So the key to all that is that no one is without hope in their change.
Absolutely not.
And
I think that just breaking it down into the simplest of steps to Shema means to put your eyes on someone, to respond and acknowledge that you heard, and then to obey the first time that you heard it.
But if they didn't break these people down, they would never have been able to do the objective that was required of them. There was a time where when you have individuals who have been stuck in their ways because they've been allowed to go in this direction, then there has to be a retraining process in order for it to work. And so at that point in time, we go into teenagers and we're having open rebellion with teenagers, and this varies depending on how rebellious that is. But the ultimate thing that has to happen is you have to somehow regain that authority structure where the child will listen to the parent. It's more work on the parent than it is the child to do this.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah. I was reading in my Bible this morning, and Yeshua talks about he has 99 sheep who are listening to his voice, and then he has one sheep that has wandered off, fallen off a cliff, and he's totally a mess and probably broken his leg or whatever. And what would a shepherd do? Go get that one, but he would put it on his shoulders. He'd keep it with him. Keep the sheep with him, as very close to him. And I think that's a principle for parenting. When you have a child that has wandered off and gone over the cliff, you are going to have to go after him. You are going to have to expend a lot of your own energy to go after him and then keep him very close to you for however long it takes to get that sheep going.
And one thing my father taught me about that whole scenario is that they would actually break the leg of the sheep. And so the sheep could not go on its own. If it tried, it would be in severe pain.
So
And so with that,
force them to be with you.
Yes, is you have to you may have to not break the legs or something like that, but you may have to go to extreme measures to get to the point where you are forcing your older child to be with you. I've heard of, we used to share this with parents when we had rebellious students in school. Basically, you take away anything that makes them think that they have authority. So what you have to do is you have to take away everything in the child's life that makes them think that they have authority. If you were having an open rebellion problem, this is like what I'm talking about. This is the drastic. This is maybe your kid, if they're having problems with like maybe even running away, or they are outspokenly, angrily arguing and yelling and fighting with you on a regular basis, kind of a thing. You have to, you've lost any authority structure with that child. You are not authority. You are at best an equal, and maybe even considered below your child in this point in time. And you have to get that authority structure back on the way it's supposed to be. And so what has to happen is, just like the military, it's the only way this happens. This doesn't happen any other way. You have to take away, they have no rights. Just like in the military, where they took away all their clothes, they take away all their possessions, they tell them when they're going to eat and how they're going to eat and everything like that. They don't have another job outside of that point in time. They are solely focused on the military. And as in our family at this point in time, if there is that much of an issue with rebellion and not listening, you have to take away their, cell phones, games, jobs,
and keep them with you.
Yes.
The shepherd would keep
and so homeschooling allows you to do that.
Yeah, but not even letting them go up to their room all the time. Being with you.
Yes.
Which I'm thinking of the verse where you lay down your life for another person. This is basically, as a parent, it's going to cost you more than it costs your child.
Yes, you are going to have more struggles. It's going to be worse before it gets better in this instance.
I just want to emphasize, though, Kraig, because I think there are going to be a lot of young parents listening.
Yes, and
that don't let it get to this point.
Yes.
Teach your children to Shema.
And I will go in this direction. I've talked about this before in any other interviews I've done and stuff on, but the key that I was taught early on when I was teaching by a athletic director I was involved with and teaching basketball and stuff, and I didn't really know what I was doing, but he said the number one thing, Kraig, for you to do is to create boundaries and to show these kids where the boundaries are. Mm-hmm. And if you do that, then even though you don't necessarily know basketball, what little bit you do know, they will be attentive to and can then implement to. And therefore, I don't have to teach as much. I don't have to teach a whole bunch of basketballology to them. I'm teaching them boundaries and respect. And the little bit I teach, they will be able to then grab onto and flourish
because they were able to hear you.
Correct. Teachers, when I was doing my internship, my beginning teaching and learning how to teach, one of the primary things that I was taught by my teacher and my professor at that one point in time, and you may not know this in school, this is done by teachers and stuff, administrators and so on and so forth, that it wasn't rules that you wanted procedures. Mm. And much over the last several years in school has been shrinking the amount of rules and increasing the amount of procedures. Mm-hmm. Because procedures are the boundaries, so to speak. The rules are the hard and fast, the big things, in which, mm-hmm. like for instance, the 10 Commandments are the hard and fast rules of God. Yeah. The rest of the Torah are the procedures teaching the children of Israel mm-hmm. how to follow the rules and be within the confines of the rules. Mm-hmm. So, the rule was to do these things. So if we're looking at that in the way of children, if we want to not have rebellious teenagers, even rebellious 10-year-olds, or even rebellious 2-year-olds, mm-hmm. is to start when the child is an infant with beginning to teach boundaries and authority structure.
So much easier at that time.
Absolutely. And so what that means is the parent has to the child is an infant. They can't crawl. They're barely able to crawl. They're barely able to walk. And the parent is the one who has to do everything. And very rarely do parents are busy, have jobs, careers, things going on at home, places they have to be. And then they have this child that comes into their life. And you're like, how do I deal with this? And they're like, and I don't want to give up everything I've done, but that's what parenting deals with. That's what God said.
Your life.
Yes, mm-hmm. for your child, mm-hmm. just as a shepherd would lay down his life for his sheep. Mm-hmm. And so you either keep them close to you and train them and teach them as a child, or you then try to force to do that with a kid who's thinks himself as equal with you at that point in time.
Or you just let him go, give up on them, and as the verse says, let the ravens of the valley pick out their eyes.
Mm-hmm. Which we don't want that to happen to any child.
No, don't give up.
Yeah, do not give up on the older ones. As a younger parent of younger children, mm-hmm. what do? Well, you teach procedures, just like we taught the eyes click, just like a dog trainer teaches through the clicking and giving morsels of food. Mm-hmm. It teaches the dog not to go beyond this boundary, or don't jump, or shake hands, or don't bark, or any of those things. The process is simply repeated repetition, being consistent, expecting the behavior. Mm-hmm. And then, as the old saying goes, don't expect if you don't inspect. So like if you tell your child, go clean your room. Well, child doesn't understand what go clean the room means. The first thing you have to do as a parent is go up there and for several times in a row is show them exactly what it means to clean up the room. Put your toys, pick them up, put them here. Take your clothes, fold them, put them away. Make your bed. Put your pillow. Here is where I want your pillow to be when you make your bed. This is where your blanket goes over on your bed. Here's where your stuffed animals go. All those kind of things. Those are the procedures, and you have to go through and do everything. exactly the way you want it, over and over and over again. And you do it with them. And that takes a lot of time. Then when that's done, then you go through and you tell them to do it, and you aren't there with them at that point in time. You let them do it, and then you come up afterwards and you inspect to see if they did it. And if they did it, great. You praise them. You tell them what a wonderful job they do, and you do that for several days in a row, and eventually they'll do it. And then you don't have to go up there all the time. But if they don't do it when you go up there, then you go back over and you just go up with them and you start teaching them again, and then you try that, and you keep doing that until you realize that they have it under control.
Since there's so much we could say, I wanted to point out we have a book, The 4 Foundations of Lifelong Learning. We'll put a link to it below the video, and it has so many ideas for parents, and it was intended for parents of preschoolers, babies on up to age 5, and it has how to do all of these procedures, how to set them up, which ones are most important. But you know what, parents of older kids could read this too, and you could say, you know what, I never did that, but I could do it now, and of course adapt it to the child's age. But we'll put a link to that. Kraig, is there anything you want to say in closing?
I would say that it's really important that we teach our children to listen, because, like, we're involved in the business of developing homeschooling curriculum, and we understand that is important. We want our kids to learn, how to speak English and do math and be articulate and all these kind of things like that. But the most important thing that we believe you as parents need to teach your children is how to listen, and how to listen to you, because if they learn to listen to you, then they can learn to listen to God also. And if you can't teach them here and now to listen to you, then it's going to be a greater stretch for them to learn to listen to God. And of course, the most important part of that is the fact that you listen to God also. If you aren't willing to be the great example to your children on how to listen, then we cannot expect our children to listen to us. To really simplify this, if you don't put your clothes away, if you don't fold your clothes and put them away every day, then how can you expect your child to do that? And this is the same way with the children of Israel, real quick. The children of Israel didn't listen to their father, and guess what? Their heavenly father, and then their children didn't listen to their heavenly father. There rose up a generation that did not know God. Why? Because they weren't trained, and they weren't seeing their parents do this. If they're seeing their parents do this consistently and dealing with their children, they would not have done this.
Yep, very true. I think there's a really good amount of wisdom in the Jewish tradition of every day saying the Shema, and starting out with here. I think that first word is there for a reason. It's the most important thing, and if we have that one down, then everything else flows from it. Shalom.
Have a great one.
So everybody, I hope you have had a really good session. This one was a special blessing for me to do with my husband, because I just kept thinking while he was talking of memories and things that have happened over the last our oldest son is 23, so over the last 23 years, and just the things we've learned and the things that he's brought us through. I didn't know any of this when I had my first child, and if this is new to you, don't worry, because I think the real reason that Yehovah gives us children is because he wants us to grow up, and he teaches us, and he's patient with us. So I don't have any questions that I see in the chat right now, so we'll wrap it up. I just wanted to remind you that we did have a handout for this session. It is available for free on the conference page, and for those that are watching later, we'll put a link to that below the video. And if you also would like to download that free book, it's available as an ebook on our conference page as well, and we hope that it is a blessing to you. So I hope you have a wonderful evening, and will join us back tomorrow night for session 5. Shalom.